The desert had gone quiet, the kind of silence that made a man feel like the land was holding its breath. For 3 months, no rain had touched the Apache Valley. The earth was cracked and gray, the air so dry it stole the moisture from your skin. In the heart of the camp, the people had gathered, not to celebrate, not to trade, but to appease the sky. At the center of a ring of stone and dust stood Aiyana, her wrists bound with braided rawhide, a turquoise pendant catching what little sunlight cut through the smoke. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something the others couldn't read. Not fear exactly, but a steady defiance. She was the chosen one for the rain sacrifice, a life offered to the spirits in exchange for the storm that would save the tribe. The drumming began, slow and deep, rolling through the ground like distant thunder. Warriors circled her, their painted faces set in grim resolve, spears and bows flashing in the half-light. Women chanted low, their voices weaving with the beat, calling on gods older than the stones beneath their feet. Aiyana lifted her chin, scanning the crowd. She knew many of them, had shared meals, laughter, even secrets, yet tonight they stood as witnesses to her death. The air smelled of sage and dust, the smoke stinging her eyes, but she didn't blink. Far beyond the edge of the camp, over a low ridge of sunburned rock, a lone figure on horseback paused. He was a stranger here, a hunter chasing game and nothing more. But when Caleb Rourke saw the bound woman framed by fire and shadow, something inside him shifted. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew, in that moment, he couldn't ride away. Caleb eased his horse down the slope, keeping low in the saddle. The drumming was louder now, the beat sharp and unrelenting, like the earth itself was pounding out a warning. He guided his mount into the cover of mesquite and boulders until he had a clear view of the camp. The Apache circle was alive with movement, men in war paint, women swaying with the rhythm, smoke curling up from the fires into the hot, still air. At the center, bound and standing proud despite the ropes, was the young woman he'd seen from the ridge. The turquoise at her throat winked in the light, but her eyes were fixed beyond the crowd, as if she were already looking past this moment. Caleb's gut twisted. He didn't know what kind of ceremony this was, but the tension in the air told him enough. She wasn't there by choice. And if the pounding in his chest was right, she didn't have much time left. He slipped from the saddle, tied his horse in the shadow of a rock outcrop, and crept forward. Every step was careful, his boots finding the softer sand so they wouldn't crunch. The chanting rose and fell like waves, masking his movements. He kept to the edges, moving between hides stretched for drying, stacks of firewood, and the low brush. Then she turned her head, just slightly, and her gaze found him. In the middle of the chaos, in a circle full of warriors, she looked at him like she'd been expecting him all along. There was no plea in her eyes, no panic. Only a fierce, steady light that said, "If you're going to act, you'd better do it now." The chief stepped forward, a tall man draped in a mantle of feathers and beads. He raised his arms to the sky, speaking in a voice that carried above the drums. Caleb couldn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The gathered warriors began to tighten their circle. 2 men moved toward her with long spears tipped in obsidian. Caleb's fingers closed around the worn grip of his Colt. He took a slow breath, eyes flicking between the girl and the warriors closing in. He didn't have a plan, just the hard knowledge that if he waited another heartbeat, it would be too late. The first shot split the air like lightning, the crack echoing off the canyon walls. A spear clattered to the ground. Shouts erupted as heads turned toward the sound. Caleb was already moving, shoving through the startled outer ring, using the chaos as his cover. A warrior lunged at him with a war club. Caleb ducked low, drove a shoulder into the man's gut, and kept moving. Another swung a knife. Caleb caught his wrist, twisted, and sent the blade spinning into the dust. The smell of sage smoke and sweat was thick in his lungs. He reached her, cutting the ropes with one hard stroke of his knife. Her wrists came free, and she stepped forward without hesitation, planting herself at his side. For a split second, they stood back to back, ringed by men who were already regaining their focus. "This way," he barked, and they broke for the edge of the camp. Spears hissed through the air. One grazed his sleeve, another thudded into the dirt at her feet. She didn't flinch, didn't even look down, just ran with the quick, sure-footed stride of someone who'd spent her life on this land. Caleb kept pace, firing once over his shoulder to keep the nearest pursuers back. They burst through the last line of warriors, the horse whinnying as they reached it. Caleb swung into the saddle and pulled her up behind him in one fluid motion. She wrapped her arms around his waist just as he spurred the animal into a gallop. Behind them, the camp roared in anger. Drums turned to shouts, shouts to war cries. The ground shook under the pounding of hooves as a few mounted warriors gave chase. Caleb drove the horse harder, feeling her grip tighten with each bound across the dry wash. They rode until the voices faded, until the only sound was the wind tearing past their ears and the hammer of his own heartbeat. When he finally slowed, they were miles from the camp, the open desert stretching ahead in every direction. She didn't speak at first. Her breath was steady against his back, her hands still holding firm. Then, softly, she said, "You shouldn't have done that." He glanced over his shoulder, meeting her gaze. "And leave you there?" Her mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Not yet. "No one's ever stepped into the circle before." "There's a first for everything," he said, turning the horse toward the distant hills. They rode on in silence, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was something else. A fragile, dangerous thread tying them together, born in fire and smoke, tempered by the choice to run. If this moment gripped you, if you could feel the heat of the fire and the thunder of the chase, hit like, subscribe, and share this story. Because the next chapter will take you deeper into the kind of Wild West rescue you'll never forget. They rode hard through the heat, the wind tearing at Caleb's hat brim and whipping strands of her black hair across his shoulder. The desert opened wide ahead of them. No cover, no shelter, only the burning gold of late afternoon and the distant shimmer of the horizon. Behind them, the sound of pursuit faded, but neither dared to slow. Caleb didn't speak, not yet. His focus was on the horse beneath them, the rhythm of its stride, the way its breath rasped as each mile took them farther from the Apache camp. But he could feel her there, the steady pressure of her arms around his waist, the solid weight of her trust. That was a heavier thing than any saddlebag. When the sun finally dipped low enough to soften the light, he angled them toward a dry arroyo. They dismounted, leading the horse into the shadowed cut between the rocks. The air here was cooler, touched by the faint scent of sagebrush. Caleb loosened the cinch, letting the animal drink from a shallow pool. She stood nearby, rubbing at her wrists where the rawhide had bit deep. Caleb noticed the red marks but said nothing. Instead, he handed her his canteen. She took it without hesitation, drinking in slow, measured sips before passing it back. "You have a name?" he asked, his voice quieter now that the danger was behind them, for the moment. "Aiyana," she said, her accent wrapping around the syllables like music. He nodded. "Caleb Rourke." She studied him in the dim light, her expression unreadable. "Why? Why what? Why step into the circle? Why risk it?" He met her gaze evenly. "Because leaving you there didn't sit right." Something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise, but a kind of recognition. She crouched near the pool, rinsing her hands, then said, "No one from outside walks into Apache ground and leaves alive." "You changed that today?" Caleb leaned against the rock, his rifle resting within reach. "You make it sound like I broke a rule." "You did," she replied, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "And rules have consequences." They shared a small meal from his saddlebags, dried venison, hard biscuits, a handful of prickly pear fruit he'd picked the day before. She ate with quiet precision, like someone used to making the most of little. When darkness fell, Caleb built a low fire, the flames tucked against the rock to keep them hidden. She sat across from him, the glow catching in her turquoise pendant. The smoke curled between them, carrying the faint, sweet tang of burning mesquite. "You're far from your home," she said. "So are you," he countered. She tilted her head. "This is my land." "Doesn't mean they didn't try to take it from you," Caleb said, nodding toward the memory of the camp. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. The drought has made people desperate. Desperation can twist what they believe is right. They fell into a silence that wasn't empty, the kind that lets two people hear each other without speaking. The fire popped softly, the horse shifted in the shadows, and above them the stars came out one by one. After a long while, she asked, "What will you do now?" "Get you someplace safe." "And after that?" He shrugged. "Haven't thought that far." Her eyes stayed on him, searching. Most men would have thought only about themselves. "I'm not most men." She gave a small nod, as if that answer fit what she already knew. Then she pulled a small pouch from the folds of her dress, loosening the thong to reveal a carved bone charm. She set it on the ground between them. "This is for crossing into places you shouldn't and living to tell it," she said. Caleb picked it up, turning it in his fingers. The carving was smooth from years of handling, the shape simple but precise. A bird with wings spread wide. "What kind of bird is it?" "One that always finds its way home," she replied. He tucked it into his coat pocket, not sure what home meant for either of them now. They rested in shifts that night. Caleb took first watch, listening to the quiet movements of the desert. The distant yip of a coyote. The rustle of something small in the brush. Every so often, his eyes drifted to where she lay wrapped in his spare blanket, her breathing slow and steady. Near dawn, she woke and took the watch without a word, settling near the fire with his rifle laid across her knees. Caleb slept lightly, knowing she'd be as quick as he was if trouble came. When the first light touched the rim of the arroyo, they packed up and rode out. The air was sharp with the cool of morning, the sky painted in streaks of rose and gold. Neither spoke for the first hour, but there was no strain in the silence. By mid-morning, they reached the edge of the high mesa. From here, the land stretched wide and empty, the horizon broken only by the faint haze of a distant settlement. Caleb reined in, scanning the trail. Aiyana's gaze followed his. "Out there?" she asked. He nodded. "Could be a town, could be trouble. But it's better than going back." She adjusted her seat behind him, her hands settling lightly at his sides. "Then we ride." He urged the horse forward, feeling the weight of the charm in his pocket, the warmth of her presence at his back. Whatever lay ahead, it was no longer just his journey. The trail off the mesa wound through a stretch of land that felt too quiet. The wind had dropped, and even the usual stir of lizards in the brush seemed absent. Caleb kept his eyes moving, scanning the ridges and the dark cuts between boulders. His gut told him they weren't alone. By midday, the faint line of the settlement still shimmered on the horizon, but it hadn't grown any closer. The land between was deceptive. Every rise seemed to promise a straight shot forward, only to spill them into another shallow basin. Aiyana rode behind him without complaint, but he could feel the way her grip on his waist tightened now and then, as if she sensed the same invisible shadow he did. When the first rider appeared, it was like watching a hawk materialize from empty sky. One moment, there was only open desert. The next, a lone figure sat his horse on a ridge 100 yards away, the sunlight flashing off a metal rifle barrel. Caleb didn't slow, but his eyes narrowed. More shapes emerged. 2, then 4, then nearly a dozen, all mounted, all watching. Some wore war paint, others carried lances or bows. The distance between them and the pair on the trail was just far enough to keep weapons idle, but close enough to show intent. Aiyana shifted slightly, her voice low. "They're from my people. They don't look happy to see us. They aren't." Caleb knew he couldn't outrun mounted men on fresh horses. He angled his own mount toward a shallow canyon where the rock walls might narrow the approach. It wasn't much, but it was better than being surrounded in the open. The sound of hoofbeats swelled as 2 riders broke from the group, descending toward them. One was an older warrior with deep lines cut into his face, his hair bound with strips of red cloth. The other was younger, broad-shouldered, his expression carved from stone. They reined up a few yards away, eyes fixed on Aiyana. The older man spoke first, his words sharp and clipped. Aiyana answered in the same tongue, her tone steady. Caleb didn't understand the exchange, but he didn't miss the way her chin lifted higher with each sentence. The younger man's gaze kept sliding to Caleb, and his hand rested lightly near the handle of his knife. Finally, Aiyana turned to Caleb. "They say I have shamed the tribe. They want me to return with them. That's not happening, Caleb said flatly. Her lips pressed into a thin line. They think you've bewitched me, that I follow you because I've lost my mind. Then tell them the truth, he said. I have. They don't believe it. The older warrior barked something else, and this time his voice rose. Aiyana answered in a sharper tone, and the young man's hand closed fully around his knife. Caleb eased his rifle from its scabbard, keeping it low but ready. In an instant, the younger warrior spurred his horse forward. Caleb swung the rifle up, the barrel tracking the man's chest, but Aiyana thrust her arm out. No, she snapped, the word carrying enough force to make both men pause. The older warrior spoke again, slower now, his gaze locked on her. She replied without looking away from him, her words like a challenge. Caleb watched the tension ripple between them, the way her voice didn't waver, even when the man's jaw clenched. Finally, the old man gave a single, curt nod. He wheeled his horse and rode back toward the ridge. The younger one hesitated, glaring at Caleb as if trying to memorize his face before following. The rest of the riders lingered a moment longer, their eyes hard and silent, before they too turned away, melting back into the hills. When the last hoofbeat faded, Caleb lowered the rifle. What just happened? They won't follow us. For now, she said, her shoulders sagging slightly. I told them if they tried to take me, they'd have to kill me in front of you, and that you'd take some of them with you. He studied her face, the set of her jaw. You weren't bluffing, were you? No. They pressed on, the settlement still a distant smear against the horizon. But the encounter left the air heavier. Caleb knew the reprieve wouldn't last. The look in that younger warrior's eyes had been a promise, one that would come due. By late afternoon, the land began to change. Low hills rolled into a rocky plain dotted with mesquite. In the shadow of one such rise, Caleb spotted something that made him rein up. A wagon sat tilted on a broken wheel, its canvas cover torn, a campfire smoldering beside it. Two men lounged nearby, rifles propped against a crate. They weren't Apache, too pale, too unkempt. One of them held something up to the light, and Caleb's breath caught. It was a necklace. Turquoise beads strung with silver, the design unmistakable. Aiyana's hand went to her throat instinctively, but found nothing there. Her voice was tight. That's mine. Caleb's mind worked fast. If those men had her necklace, they'd crossed paths with her people, or with her. Either way, they were trouble. He glanced at the distant settlement, then back at the camp. They see us yet? He asked. She shook her head. Good, he said, sliding from the saddle. Stay here. But her hand caught his arm. I'm not staying behind again. They locked eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once, the decision made between them without another word. Together, they moved low through the mesquite, the smell of wood smoke and dust growing stronger with each step. Caleb kept his rifle cradled, his breath slow and steady. Aiyana was silent beside him, her steps as soft as shadow. The voices from the camp grew clearer, crude jokes, laughter that had an edge to it. Caleb felt the tight coil in his chest wind a little tighter. Whatever came next, it would not end with polite conversation. They reached the last line of brush, the wagon and its owners laid bare before them. Caleb's eyes found the necklace again, the turquoise winking in the dying light. He felt Aiyana shift beside him, her fingers brushing the knife at her belt. He looked at her, and she gave a single, deliberate nod. It was time. Caleb steadied his breathing, every sense tuned to the men by the broken wagon. The turquoise necklace caught the dying sun again, and that glint hit him harder than a bullet. It wasn't just a trinket. It was proof these men had crossed a line they couldn't be allowed to step back from. Aiyana crouched beside him, her gaze locked on the thieves. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes burned with something deeper than anger. This was personal. Caleb knew enough not to tell her to hang back. She'd already made her choice. The two men were distracted, bickering over something in a canvas sack. Caleb and Aiyana moved together, silent in the mesquite's shadow. Each step shortened the gap, the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies curling into their noses. When they were close enough to hear every word, Caleb rose, rifle leveled. That necklace doesn't belong to you. The taller of the two spun around, his hand going for the rifle by the crate. Caleb fired a shot into the dirt between his boots. Try again, and the next one's not a warning. The other man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She's Apache. We take what we want from their kind. Aiyana stepped forward before Caleb could speak, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. You took more than you understand. The taller man's smirk faltered. Caleb could see it, the realization that she wasn't afraid of them. That's when the younger thief lunged for his pistol. Caleb shifted his aim and shot the revolver clean out of his hand, the metal skittering into the dirt. The taller man reached for the necklace hanging from his belt. Maybe to throw it, maybe to use it as leverage. He never got the chance. Aiyana closed the distance in 2 strides, her knife flashing. She didn't cut him, just the leather thong holding the necklace. She yanked it free and stepped back, the turquoise resting safe in her palm. You're lucky, she told him coldly, that I've already had enough blood for one day. Caleb kept his rifle trained on them as they backed away, their bravado gone, replaced by the wary shuffle of men who'd been measured and found wanting. Take your busted wagon and get out, he said. If I see you again, it won't end like this. They didn't argue. Within minutes, the thieves were nothing but silhouettes against the far ridge. Aiyana turned the necklace over in her hands, the turquoise catching the firelight as Caleb struck a match to the small pile of kindling. She fastened it back around her neck, fingers lingering on the familiar weight. It's not just jewelry, she said quietly, watching the flames take hold. It was my mother's. She wore it the day I was born. I thought I'd never see it again. Caleb poked at the fire with a stick, his expression unreadable in the flicker. Then I'm glad we came across those bastards, she smiled faintly. You came across them. I just followed. You didn't just follow, he said, meeting her eyes. You stood your ground. That makes you part of the reason they're still breathing. They ate a simple meal by the fire, the night stretching wide and quiet around them. When the flames burned low, Aiyana lay back against her blanket, looking up at the scatter of stars. Caleb sat nearby, keeping watch, the rifle across his knees. After a long silence, she spoke. When we reach your world, the one beyond this desert, what will it be like? He considered the question. Different. Louder. More people than you can count. And 1,000 ways to lose yourself if you're not careful. Her gaze didn't waver from the sky. And you? Will you lose yourself there? Not if I've got someone worth finding my way back to. She looked at him then, and the firelight caught in her eyes. No more words passed between them, but something unspoken settled into place. An understanding forged in danger and sealed by choice. The next morning, they broke camp early, riding toward the distant line where the desert gave way to hills. With every mile, the open land felt different, not less dangerous, but less like it was trying to keep them apart. By the time the sun was high, the first outline of the settlement rose ahead, shimmering in the heat. Caleb slowed the horse, letting her take in the sight. Wooden storefronts, a church steeple, the faint glint of a train's water tower, all pieces of a world she'd never seen, and he was about to show her. As they rode into the dusty main street, heads turned. People stepped aside, their curiosity mingled with suspicion. Caleb ignored them, guiding the horse toward the boarding house at the far end. Aiyana sat tall behind him, her eyes scanning everything, memorizing every sound and smell. They stopped in front of the porch, and Caleb swung down, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation, sliding to the ground with the grace of someone who'd learned to stand tall in the face of anything. Welcome, he said simply. This is where we start over. And for the first time since he'd pulled her from that circle of fire and smoke, she allowed herself to believe him. If this moment stayed with you, if you felt every beat of the chase, every flicker of firelight between them, hit like, subscribe, and share this story. There are more Wild West rides ahead, and you won't want to miss where Caleb and Aiyana go next.